Tonight at 10, the Prime Minister spells out her strategic goals for taking Britain out of the European Union. In a long-awaited speech, Mrs May says Britain will leave the single market, seek new trade agreements and control immigration.
While I am sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain.
Parliament will get a vote on the final Brexit deal. Labour says Mrs May's approach involves enormous dangers.
If all her optimism of a deal with the European Union didn't work, we would move into a low-tax corporate taxation, bargain basement economy.
And an equally unenthusiastic response at the European Parliament from the chief Brexit negotiator.
It creates also an illusion, the illusion that you can go out of the single market, that you can go out of the customs union, and that you can cherry pick, that you can have still a number of advantages.
In Scotland, where voters backed Remain, the First Minister said a second independence referendum was still on the cards.
I'm not prepared for Scotland to be taken down a path that I firmly believe is going to be damaging.
We'll have detail and reaction, and we'll be asking business leaders for their response. Also tonight, the rising price of fuel and food is a factor in driving inflation to the highest level in 2.5 years. And Sir Simon Rattle talks to us about his plans for the London Symphony Orchestra.
Here, a peaceful protest from Southern Rail passengers, but there's a glimmer of hope as drivers' strikes are suspended. And an inquest finds a soldier was killed in friendly fire in Afghanistan because his comrade didn't take enough care.
Good evening. The Prime Minister has set out her vision for Britain's place in the world after it leaves the European Union. The vision rested on 12 objectives, and Theresa May declared that no deal would be better than a bad deal. The main announcement today was that the UK would be leaving the European single market with the aim of negotiating a free trade agreement instead of that. The Prime Minister said that this would deliver control over immigration from EU countries. And she said that the final Brexit deal would be subject to a vote in both Houses of Parliament. Tonight we'll have the detail and the reaction for you. We start with our political editor, Laura Kuensberg.
Good morning, what's the plan?
On her way.
Have you got a plan?
On our way out. Not just of the European Union, but after months of anticipation.
Are we going to get a detailed plan, Prime Minister?
Theresa May gathered ministers and ambassadors too. To confirm, finally, we'll leave behind the way the country's made its living for decades.
As a priority, we will pursue a bold and ambitious free trade agreement with the European Union. This agreement should allow for the freest possible trade in goods and services between Britain and the EU's member states. It should give British companies the maximum freedom to trade with and operate within European markets, and let European businesses do the same in Britain. But I want to be clear. What I am proposing cannot mean membership of the single market.
Privately, ministers had talked of preserving some parts of the special club, the market of hundreds of millions where our businesses can buy and sell with no barriers. Remainers had pushed her, but she believes it can't be done because the rules of the single market come with unlimited EU immigration.
The message from the public before and during the referendum campaign was clear. Brexit must mean control of the number of people who come to Britain from Europe, and that is what we will deliver.
Our customs arrangements, how we trade over borders, will change too, but no final decision on how. Her clear hope, though, is that the UK will not pay billions to the EU each year.
There may be some specific European programmes in which we might want to participate. If so, and this will be for us to decide, it's reasonable that we should make an appropriate contribution. But the principle is clear. The days of Britain making vast contributions to the European Union every year will end.
27 other countries will decide if her plans are an ambitious wish list or a fantasy. Yet most dramatically, if after 2 years of talks, negotiations stall, she and her team are willing to walk away.
Britain wants to remain a good friend and neighbour to Europe. Yet I know there are some voices calling for a punitive deal that punishes Britain and discourages other countries from taking the same path. Britain would not, indeed we could not, accept such an approach. And while I am confident that this scenario need never arise, while I am sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain. Thank you.
But remember, the Prime Minister never wanted to leave. During the referendum campaign, you said plainly you believed if we left the EU and the single market, the country, its families, its citizens would be worse off. Now, either you have changed your mind, or, as Prime Minister, you have made a decision that you believe will leave the country and its citizens poorer. Which is it?
All the economic indicators have been more positive than people had predicted. It's only earlier this week, that the IMF confirmed that we were the fastest growing economy last year. And what I'm talking about today is the country coming together and looking for that brighter future as a global Britain.
Did the Brexit backers in the cabinet get the upper hand?
It was an excellent speech. It was optimistic, it was confident, and it set out our responsibilities in a global context. So this wasn't an inward-looking, purely European speech.
It's negotiable. This is something that I think will be good for the UK and good for the rest of the EU as well.
But why should they give us a free lunch or allow us to have our cake and
Well,
eat
it's
it?
going to be, as the Prime Minister has just said, I think it's going to be good for both sides.
Do you think what she set out is achievable?
We shall have to see.
And improve the quality of people's lives across the whole country.
Not exactly nodding along either, the other parties across the UK. The political consequences of Theresa May's choices are unclear.
I think we have to have a deal that ensures we have access to the market, we have British jobs dependent on that market. That's what we'll be pushing for. Whether it's specifically this form of single market, I don't know. She seems to be wanting to have a cake and eat it.
Wave the white flag across the cliffs of Dover, as Theresa May has just done, and give up on what's best for Britain is an insult to business, it is damaging to Britain's future, and it is also a theft of democracy.
And don't doubt, a UK outside the single market brings the chance for Scottish voters to choose independence closer.
I will not allow Scotland's interests to be steamrollered, because a choice is emerging here. Do we want to be taken down a path that we didn't vote for and is against all of our interests, or do we want to take control of our own future? And that is a choice that I think Scotland has the right to make.
Parliament was told today they will get a vote on the final deal. But it's plain the Prime Minister believes the country has delivered a clear verdict, and she has made her mind up, drawn her big conclusions. Her dilemmas now are persuading a continent what she wants is possible, and those who voted to stay in the EU that it's even desirable. But this is really only the start of a long process. Much will change. Concern and criticism won't fade away. The scale of what we decided, how it will change our country and all our lives, is still fully to emerge. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, as Laura was telling us, one of the Prime Minister's most significant announcements was the plan to leave the European single market of around 500 million consumers and the plan to leave the EU customs union. That is the system which allows goods to move between countries without attracting tariffs. Our correspondent James Landhill is with me here with his analysis of what that could mean for trade in future. James.
Hugh, the single market is the beating heart of the European Union, the trading arrangement that binds the economic club together. Every EU country is a full member of the club. Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Switzerland are partial members. And they all believe that if they get rid of barriers to trade and allow goods, services, money and workers to move freely across their borders, then their economies will grow. To make this happen, they agree common trading rules so that a widget made in Greece is the same as a widget made in Spain. And they set up a European Court of Justice to make sure everybody follows the rules. Supporters say the single market helps British companies flourish, like this engineering firm in Bristol, by making it easier for them to export their goods and employ people from across the EU.
I think there's an obvious risk for us outside of the single market. We increasingly trade with Europe. I think any change in the customs regime is probably going to make us uncompetitive.
But opponents say the single market imposes unnecessary red tape on British firms like this nappy manufacturer in Northampton. It gives too much power to EU judges and allows in too many migrant workers. And the owner of this firm says the opportunities outside are greater.
I think primarily we can't remain part of the single market because we want to go out and do our trade deals with countries outside the EU, and that's very exciting for companies such as ours.
So to help make that happen, Theresa May wants Britain to have instead the greatest possible access to the single market, particularly for British cars, lorries and financial services, and to get that by negotiating a new free trade deal with the EU, if she can and if they're willing. And what about the so-called customs union that Mrs May referred to? This is the arrangement under which European governments impose no tariffs or import taxes on goods traded within the EU. But they do agree to charge the same tariffs on non-EU goods being imported into the Union. Now, the Prime Minister said she didn't want Britain to be bound by this anymore. She wants Britain instead to be able to set up its own tariffs and negotiate its own trade deals and accept some kind of new customs arrangement so that trade within the EU could be frictionless. But she didn't explain how. And if there's no deal, British firms could end up paying tariffs they don't pay right now. So this is what the Prime Minister wants. All she has to do now is get the rest of the EU to agree, and that's far from certain. Now, I've just skated over the surface of what are some pretty important issues. You can read a lot more in detail on the BBC News website and the BBC Reality Checks assessment of how any deal might work. Hugh.
James, thanks very much again. James Landell there for us. Well, business leaders, as we've heard, still divided on the implications of Brexit. But most of them today seem to welcome some new clarity from the Prime Minister on the government's plans. Theresa May promised that changes to immigration, customs, regulation would be phased in to avoid too much disruption. Some of Britain's most prominent business leaders are at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. Our business correspondent Simon Jack has been talking to some of them.
There's nothing like a bit of mountain air to give you clarity. Business leaders gathered here in Switzerland were watching the Prime Minister today for exactly that. So did they get it?
I think what we learned from the Prime Minister's speech today was clarity, first of all, really codified what many of us had been anticipating since the referendum result, particularly around the single market. I think what we've also seen today is the government's willingness to put a bit of edge into the negotiating dynamic, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Trade negotiations are negotiations, and you have to lay out and you have to be pretty tough to get what you want.
For some, the uncertainty is still too great. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, has already decided to move some business to Europe.
We've still got to pursue a subsidiary in the EU post-Brexit world, meaning that we can still serve our customers and policyholders in those European Union countries.
So no ifs, no buts, no single market. Clarity, yes. Desired outcome, not for everyone. And with the continuing question mark over whether we're a partial member of the customs union, many companies will say, for example, it takes a continent to build a car. And if there are hold-ups at the border, that could be bad news. And the car industry gave MPs its version of clarity on the consequences of not getting a good trade deal.
The cars that we import, and remember we import about 80% of the vehicles we sell in the UK, that would add about £2.7 billion or about £1,500 per car sold.
Financial markets were watching closely too. Suddenly, the pound rocketed against the dollar at the very moment the Prime Minister offered MPs a chance to vote on any final deal. Markets making one last bet that Brexit could still be derailed. But even some of the business world's staunchest Remainers weren't fooled and are now resigned to knuckling down to the political reality.
Most businesses are trying to move forward positively, have accepted the result of the referendum, are trying to ensure the complexity of this is well understood, and we take the steps both in government and business to deal with this and minimise the impacts of this very complex process.
The government shed some light on its priorities, but business knows we are still in the foothills of a massive undertaking. Simon Jack, BBC News, Davos.
Well, the main Brexit negotiator for the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt, has warned that it's an illusion to think Britain will be allowed to keep the advantages of trade with the European Union without accepting the obligations. Our correspondent Damien Grammaticus has been assessing the reaction among members of the European Parliament in Strasbourg.
Good afternoon, Mr Juncker. Very big day for Brexit, sir.
He wasn't commenting, but Jean-Claude Juncker and his EU commissioners today were listening to Theresa May, keen to hear her vision for Brexit. The response from the European Parliament's chief negotiator, it doesn't add up.
It creates also an illusion, the illusion that you can go out of the single market, that you can go out of the customs union, and that you can cherry pick, that you can have still a number of advantages. I think that this will not happen.
The EU today was busy with its own affairs, electing a new president of the European Parliament. Many here are sceptical the UK can get all it wants in a special trade and customs deal.
We would all love to have a Europe à la carte. Cherry picking, as they call now. But this is serious. We have a lot of countries here, a lot of people, and we have to take care of everybody. This is not, Europe à la carte.
Outside, an Italian school group on an EU tour. Quitting the single market and shunning its freedom of movement will, some here believe, be a painful process for the UK. Something they say Theresa May did not address.
I expect many businesses from the UK to move to Europe. I expect also some financial companies providing services from the city will also move to Europe, so there will be some significant losses. Theresa May hasn't mentioned a word about these potential costs and potential losses.
And as for the threat Mrs May might walk away, choosing no deal if she isn't satisfied, that hasn't gone down well, even with the UK's closest neighbours.
But no deal will also be bad for the United Kingdom, so it isn't as if they hold all the cards. The United Kingdom will look after its own interests. We will look after ours.
And here today, one MEP summed up reactions to me, saying he thought Theresa May was overselling to the British people both what she could achieve in trade deals with other countries and how much access she would get to the single market. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News, Strasbourg.
Well, the Prime Minister claimed today that she wanted to act in the interests of all parts of the United Kingdom and said the devolved administrations should be fully engaged in the process of Brexit. But how was that viewed in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland? Let's start in Glasgow tonight with our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon responded to Theresa May's speech today by saying she thinks it has increased the chances that there may be a second referendum on Scottish independence. The First Minister said it's now clear that the UK is heading for a hard Brexit, which she thinks will be economically catastrophic. Now, you may remember at the end of last year, Nicola Sturgeon presented the Prime Minister with a paper outlining how she believes that Scotland could stay in the European single market even if the rest of the UK leaves. But to do that, they would need the consent of the UK government. And the First Minister said today she doesn't believe that Theresa May is really taking that seriously. And so that's why she says even though a majority in Scotland, according to the opinion polls, do not at the moment favour independence, nonetheless, she thinks the prospect of a second vote is now more likely.
Northern Ireland is the part of the UK most exposed to fallout from Brexit because it shares a border with the Irish Republic. Theresa May today was quick to point out there would be no return to the borders of the past. She said the common travel area would be preserved. But questions remain, and one key question is this. The UK wants to limit, wants to control immigration from the EU. But how would that be possible if Ireland has an open border? Another question, if the UK steps outside the customs union, won't that inevitably lead towards a hard border with customs posts?
Unlike Northern Ireland and Scotland, Wales voted to leave. Despite that, some concerns today economically, particularly in areas like manufacturing and farming, still very strong in Wales, still very reliant on exports to the EU. Politically, here at the Assembly, the First Minister, Cadwyn Jones, has a problem. He has consistently called for full and unfettered access to the single market. Today's announcement won't make that any easier. He knows that, and that's why he has said things he believes are going in the wrong direction. There's also the question of political leverage as well for him, because if he complains too much about it, then ministers at Westminster will turn round and say to him they are delivering what the people of Wales have voted for, which was Brexit. Hugh.
Nick, thanks very much. Nick Savini, thanks to you, to Gavin Hewitt and to Sarah Smith as well. Well, as we've heard, the Prime Minister acknowledged that last year's referendum campaign had been a very divisive one, but she insisted that people were now coming together, in her view. We sent our correspondent Jeremy Cook to see how those on different sides of the argument had responded to today's speech.
Boston, an ancient English town, a changing landscape. On the bus, plenty of support for the Prime Minister's speech. The Brexit vote here was 75%. More than 1 in 10 people here are EU migrants.
We want that cut in, definitely, yeah.
What effect has it had on the town?
This town, it's killed it.
Is it a price worth paying to come out of the single market in order to control immigration?
I think so, yes. You've got to control it in some way.
At the Boston Bodies Hub, it's 60s dance workout. The project is largely EU funded, but most here voted Brexit. Many worried about levels of immigration and the impact on their town.
It's just got too much now, so...
The worry is we might lose some trade with Europe because of controlling the borders. What do you think about that trade-off?
The trade-off, I think, will be worth it, because I think Britain's big enough to take care of itself.
I think Britain could cope.
You're confident, aren't you?
I'm confident Britain can cope. It's Great Britain, it always has been, it always will be. I think Europe need us.
Outside Boston, the agricultural heartland. Many crops being prepared today will need migrant workers to pick and to process.
Within the industry, we need labour, and without it, we will starve.
What would you say to Theresa May then, in terms of what you need now as an industry?
I'm hoping from this that she's going to allow skills and labour to be filled within the farming community, within packhouse, within processing, within the field labour, where it's required.
These workers are essential to you, aren't they?
They are absolutely essential.
An hour's drive and we're on the banks of the Trent. In Rushcliffe, they voted 57% to remain in the EU.
A flat white, please.
At the Spoke & Co cafe and bike shop, a different view of today's speech.
I voted to remain, and I was quite surprised by the outcome of the vote, but Theresa May has outlined today is what the country voted for, which is Brexit, and I think we need clear leadership to make sure that that's what happens.
Not everyone here is quite as relaxed.
I don't think we realise how bad it is yet.
Do you think we're any clearer tonight after Theresa May's speech about what Brexit actually means?
No. No, I don't. Essentially, her message was the same. Brexit means Brexit, but we still don't really know what it means.
For the Prime Minister then, Brexit remains the greatest of political challenges in this still divided nation. Jeremy Cook, BBC News, Nottingham.
So let's take stock tonight. Let's go live to Downing Street, talk to Laura Kuenssberg, our political editor. Yes, more clarity on the goals today, Laura, but surely all of these are still just aspirations until those talks take place.
Well, Hugh, you're right. We didn't get chapter and verse on what our new immigration system will look like outside the European Union. Theresa May even said she still had an open mind over how we deal with customs, how we trade over borders. So there is an awful lot still to be decided, to be argued over a process that is going to take years, not months. But, you know, the bold brushstrokes were all there explicitly, really, for the first time. And it's a reminder to those who see Theresa May's trade work as being caution, who somehow mistake that for the fact that she's somehow meek. She's somebody who's not willing to be tough when the moment comes. But, you know, the real rub is whether or not she's being hopelessly optimistic. Is this all a delusion? Or Or is she being mercifully clear ahead of a very complicated diplomatic dance? Of course, the reality is she won't be the one who decides that. That will be a process of negotiation with 27 other countries. We are outnumbered in the negotiations, and there is huge scepticism around the continent over whether what she's promised today is remotely achievable. And it's a process of negotiation, slow, painstaking negotiation, that will come to that final judgment. And remember, her predecessor, David Cameron, was forced to go after an European negotiation that went wrong for him. Remember, not so long ago, he quit just on that spot there. And although so much has happened since then, it's only about 6 months ago, the memory of that somehow hangs heavy in this street tonight.
Laura, again, thanks very much for that analysis. Laura Kuenssberg in Downing Street. So with that, let's turn to some of the day's other news now. The annual rate of inflation measured by the Consumer Prices Index rose more than expected in December to its highest level for 2.5 years. It rose to 1.6% last month, driven in part by the fall in the value of sterling after the Brexit vote, as well as a rise in airfares and food and fuel prices. Our economics correspondent Andrew Verity has been looking at the figures.
This haulier based near Heathrow Airport is facing sharply higher costs. Fuel had been falling in price, but on today's inflation numbers, it's up by 10%. The company can absorb that cost, but not forever.
The cost of the fuel is starting to bite. Eventually, we'll have to put a fuel surcharge in, like everybody else in this industry, once we go past a certain level, because we cannot afford to keep those costs in-house.
The effect of the weaker pound is most obvious up the supply chain, where raw materials, most of them imported, are up by 15.8% year on year. So far, producers haven't been passing most of that on, with prices at the factory gate up 2.7%. Only now is that starting to feed through to shop prices, up 1.6%.
The bigger move from the sterling effect is still to come because contracts have to be renewed, and that's where we think inflation moves up much further from the 1.6% that we've seen today, above 3%.
Today, the weak pound started to hit smartphone users where it really hurts, in the apps. Apple announced it was raising the price of apps costing 79 pence to 99 pence. That's a 25% rise. From Apple's point of view, what money it makes here in pounds has to be translated back into dollars. And right now that means it's getting fewer dollars than it did, so it has to raise prices to make up. Food prices are still lower than they were a year ago, and competition between retailers is preventing them from raising the prices of most goods. But the upward pressure on costs is likely to build. Expect higher inflation in the months to come. Andy Verity, BBC News.
Let's have a brief look at some of the day's other news stories now then. President Obama has commuted the sentence of Chelsea Manning, who was found guilty of leaking classified US Army documents to the WikiLeaks website and is serving a 35-year prison sentence. The White House says Chelsea Manning, who served as a soldier in Iraq, was formerly known as Bradley Manning, will now be released in May. Supreme Court has cleared the way for a Libyan man to take legal action against the government following his kidnapping in 2004. Abdel Hakim Belhaj says that MI6 provided information that enabled the US to abduct him and his wife in Asia and their rendition to Tripoli. Mr Belhaj intends to sue the former Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, who was responsible for MI6 at the time. Mr Straw denies any involvement. Concerns about security at a Tunisian resort where 30 Britons were killed by an Islamist gunman were raised months before the attack took place. The inquest has heard that a report in January of 2015 for the UK government suggested there was a low standard of protection at some hotel entrances in the area of Sousse. President Putin has dismissed allegations that Russia had gathered compromising material on the US President-elect Donald Trump as total nonsense, he said. The Russian president said that the leaked information, which appeared last week in the US media, was obviously fake. Now, one of Donald Trump's closest advisors has told the BBC that the United States would win any trade war with China. Anthony Scaramucci has warned that retaliation over tariffs will hurt China more than the US. China's president spoke today about the benefits of globalization, saying protectionism was like locking oneself in a dark room. The speech was delivered at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, is there. And Kamal, with those remarks in mind, do you think that the prospect comes closer of some kind of trade war between China and the US?
Well, Hugh, President Xi Jinping certainly made it clear that he didn't want a trade war and didn't believe that anyone would win if there was a trade war between China and America. It's minus 17 degrees centigrade here in Davos tonight, and it looks like the US-Chinese relationship is about as chilly as that. We had a remarkable sort of through-the-looking-glass moment today. The leader of the largest communist party in the world coming to the home of capitalism, the World Economic Forum, extolling the virtues of free trade and globalization at the same time as President-elect Donald Trump, leader of the largest capitalist economy in the world, is saying he wants to rip up the rules on free trade, that China is guilty of dumping goods and of losing millions of American jobs. Xi Jinping is playing a clever game. As America turns inward, he thinks he can extend China's economic influence around the world, and particularly in Asia. He said that he didn't want a trade war, but boy, his tough words today felt like he might be preparing for one.
Kamal, thanks very much again. Kamal Ahmed there for us, our economics editor in Davos. Well, Sir Simon Rattle, the new music director of the London Symphony Orchestra, says he'll start his first season in September with a 10-day celebration, including an all-British lineup of composers for the opening concert. Sir Simon, who's currently the artistic director of the Berlin Philharmonic, has been speaking to our arts editor, Will Gompertz.
The London Symphony Orchestra in rehearsals of a new work by the British composer Mark Anthony Turnage, with Simon Rattle, soon to be their new boss, taking them through their paces.
Good to be back. Lovely.
He's taking on a heavy workload. For the next year, he'll continue in his role at the Berlin Philharmonic, while also being music director of the LSO and the frontman of the fundraising campaign for a new concert hall for London.
How important is it to you that concert hall gets built?
It was one of the things I first asked the orchestra about when they came to talk to me. We all know this is an if, not necessarily a when. It will mean, if it happens, an enormous amount of fundraising.
He's described the orchestra's current home at the Barbican Centre as merely serviceable, and said today that 20% of the LSO's potential repertoire cannot be performed there.
It's for all the strengths of the Barbican, that also there are many limitations, limitations of size, among other things, but also of sight lines, of theatrical possibilities.
Simon Rattle made his name with the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, now under the musical direction of Mirga Gražinytė Tyla, who is operating under severe financial constraints.
One of your great loves, the CBSO. It's been cut quite hard.
Oh. No, I mean, this is a terrible thing. At the time where the orchestra is on such a high, they've appointed Mirga is a simply wonderful conductor, another very charismatic personality.
At what point do those sort of cuts start to have a very real effect on the ability of the orchestra to perform?
Absolutely now.
He says he'll do his best to help, adding another job to a lengthening to-do list for his return to Britain in September. Will Gompertz, BBC News.
Now, Newsnight is already underway on BBC Two. Here on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.